why today are we so far from, in terms of nuclear, the state we were at in the Cold War? Because people after the fall of the wall thought that the nuclear threat was kind of drifting away.
Well, they felt wrongly. I certainly didn't feel that. In fact, if you look at the planning documents immediately after the fall of the Berlin Wall, they are very revealing. I wrote about them right away. A book about them came out within a year or two. Immediately after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Bush administration, first Bush administration, came out with a new national security strategy and the defense budget for the next year. And reading them was extremely interesting and very revealing. It was clear Cold War's over. But what the documents said is everything will go on as before, but with new pretexts. So it said for example, we must maintain our intervention forces directed at the Middle East. And then there was a phrase that said something like, where the threat to our interests could not be laid at the Kremlin's door. Well, thank you. We've been lying to you for 50 years. But now we tell you the truth because we can't blame it on the Kremlin anymore. We're going to have the same intervention forces and the same plans, but not laid at the Kremlin's door. Whose door? Radical nationalism, meaning local populations which don't do what we tell them to do. Actually, that was the main reason all along, if you look at the history and the internal records, but it was concealed by the Russians are coming. Okay, now no more Russians are coming. Can't lay the threats at the Kremlin's door. We do the same things as before. The clouds have lifted. We're attacking independent nationalism as before. They talked about why we have to maintain a huge advanced military force, even though there are no Russians. The reason is, this may sound like a joke, but it's not. The reason was the technological sophistication of third world powers. That's why we need this huge military force, by now bigger than the rest of the world combined, because of the technological sophistication of third world powers, not because of the superpower enemy. We have to maintain what they call the defense industrial base. The term defense industrial base is a euphemism for high-tech industry. High-tech industry in the United States is not based on free enterprise and markets, only peripherally. High-tech industry is an outgrowth of the dynamic state sector of the economy. That includes electronics-based industry like computers and the internet and telecommunications and so on. And it also includes biology-based industry like pharmaceuticals and so on. The primary driving force in it, the initiative, the basic research, the development, is carried out in the state sector, either directly in national labs and universities or else by government funding, so that the public pays the costs and takes the risks, and if anything comes out that's marketable, you hand it over to private enterprises to profit from. That's what our system is, fundamentally. And the defense industrial base has been the cover for the electronics-based component of high-tech industry. Everything you're now using, for example, or anyone who uses a computer or the internet. Actually, it's the basis for international travel, tourism. That's where civilian aircraft come from. It's the basis for trade, which is based on containers developed in the U.S. Navy, and so on, right across the board. I mean, some exceptions, but that's the main part. So we have to maintain the defense industrial base. That is the public subsidy to high-tech industry and advanced industry for the benefit of later private profit. And it goes right along the line like this. In short, everything will be as before, but now sort of framed differently, which is what happened. And it goes on. And so, for example, Gorbachev made a major concession to George Bush I. He agreed, surprisingly, to allow a reunified Germany to become part of NATO. Now, for Russia, that is a major security threat. After all, Germany alone practically destroyed Russia twice in the first half of the century, last century, to allow Russia, Germany, unified Germany, to become a part of a hostile military alliance is an extreme security threat. But he agreed, and there was a bargain. The bargain was that Gorbachev would agree to that, and in return, the U.S. would agree not to extend NATO to the east, making the security threat even worse. That was the agreement. And in return for that agreement, actually, Russia did begin to move to reduce its offensive nuclear forces. It adopted a no-first strike doctrine, unlike NATO, which maintains it, and made many other moves, until 1994, when Clinton withdrew the bargain. They simply said, okay, we're not going to keep their side of the bargain, and they started expanding NATO to the east. Russia had also called for a nuclear-free zone from the Arctic to the Baltic, I think. U.S. refused, didn't want a nuclear-free zone there because it wanted to expand NATO to the east and take over more of the world. Of course, serious threat to Russia. Well, you know, this, when Bush came along, and Bush too, and sharply escalated the threat, which he did. They began at once with a program of aggressive militarism, first of all tearing to shreds and abandoning the framework of arms control treaties that had been laboriously established, including, in effect, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, though they could go into that, but in effect they did, and taking very hostile actions and aggressive stance and so on. The Russians reacted. They reacted by sharply, and exactly as predicted, by significantly increasing their own offensive military capacity, new weapons, new nuclear weapons, new delivery systems, nuclear submarines, and so on, now quite sophisticated, not on the U.S. scale, but enormous. They kept their missiles on, nuclear-armed missiles on hair-trigger alert automated response systems, just like ours are. We know that ours have innumerable failures, which are hundreds of failures, which are caught by human intervention, often a minute or two before terminal nuclear war takes place. Their systems have deteriorated. The economy suffered a sharp blow in the 1990s in Russia under liberalization, which is normal. A position of market economies tends to demolish the economy very often. In fact, there was a demographic catastrophe in Russia. Millions of people aren't there who would be there if normal growth rates had continued. It's basically the equivalent of a purge, if you want to think of it that way. But so the systems are much less, function much more poorly than ours. They're much more dangerous. But we're forcing them to rely on such systems. And that they have to transfer missiles all over their huge territory to counter U.S. threats. U.S. intelligence knows that Chechen rebels have been casing the Russian railroad lines to see if they can steal things. So maybe they'll steal some nuclear-armed missiles. I mean, for all sorts of reasons, the threat of just accidental nuclear war is increasing significantly as a result of aggressive militarism on the part of the Bush administration. And this is by no means a secret. I mean, it's not talked about very much, but if you read the literature on strategic analysts, they're very concerned about it, and very sober sources. I mean, Robert McNamara, the former Secretary of Defense, warns of what he calls apocalypse soon, meaning total destruction, if we continue on this course because of these mechanisms. The Journal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, which is about as sober and respectable as you can get, has an article about 2 years ago by two leading mainstream strategic analysts who say that the current policies are leading to what they call ultimate doom. They say if the American political system can't handle this, it's something deeply wrong with it. And they think that the American political system can't handle it. In fact, they call upon China to save us, which is pretty shocking. They say that of all the major powers, China is the one that has held back from expanding its offensive military forces. And China has been in the lead in trying to block unilateral U.S. efforts to drive through what they call a missile defense system, which means militarization of space. Everyone knows on all sides that what's called missile defense is a first strike weapon, and that militarization of space means a vast expansion of destructive capacity and uncertainty. Well, first Clinton, but more seriously under Bush, the U.S. has unilaterally blocked efforts at the UN Disarmament Commission to expand the Outer Space Treaty to prevent militarization of space. The Bush administration came in and they expanded it further. The Clinton doctrine had called for what they called control of space for military purposes. The Bush administration went on to what they call ownership of space. Not just control, full ownership. Nobody gets near it. We own it, and we'll use it for military purposes, any that we like, which will include offensive laser weapons, other monstrous devices, maybe nuclear-powered satellites up in a whole string of hideous proposals, which you can read. They're all public. But that'll be our ownership of space for military purposes. Well, others react, just as they react when you invade Iraq. I mean, it was perfectly well understood and predicted by intelligence agencies and others that the invasion of Iraq would spur nuclear proliferation and terror for good reasons. For one thing, just out of anger. But for another, these are the only means of deterrence that others have. Nobody's going to deter the United States with a war. I mean, the U.S. spends about as much as the rest of the world combined in military spending, and it's far more advanced technologically and much more sophisticated. I mean, it's a colossal war machine, the United States, and no one is going to confront it directly. So the only ways of deterring it are nuclear weapons and terror. So yes, it was assumed the war would in fact escalate those threats, and it has. You look at the same intelligence agencies and analysts, they say it happened, in fact, beyond what they anticipated. But the dynamism is understood. It's not secret. It's pathetic that it's not being discussed. It is the major threat to survival of the species, and a serious threat.